Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the Feet of Jesus, where he's systematically breaking down the audience before him, which includes us. By using the law and expounding on it, he's just showing us that our evil hearts could never enter the kingdom. Because God's standards are so much higher than any man's made standard. Now, he's going to touch on a subject that's very heavy and difficult: divorce and remarriage. But we have to understand he's not going in-depth teaching on the subject. So we have to be careful here. It's not the end-all and be-all on the subject. He's simply, once again, trying to expose our hearts and the fact that our righteousness is not acceptable to enter into the kingdom. And he's going to do that by, again, presenting the law to us as it should be. We keep that in mind, but as we've seen before too, there's a sense where he's not just doing it, he's also teaching would-be disciples a little something about what it means to follow him. And we're going to see that as well together. So, without further ado, let's begin this very short section. Only 2 verses, but because of what it's about, it's very heavy. So we'll take our time. He starts by saying, "It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." Right away, his language seems to have changed from what we've seen in 2 ways. The first being, it was also said. The way he presents it. He's always said, it was said of old, or you've heard it said of this, showing this idea of passing the law over. But this seems different. Like he's going in another direction. Especially when you realize what he's saying. We've seen it twice now. We've seen twice Jesus literally quote the 10 Commandments. Right? Do not murder and do not commit adultery. Well, he's not quoting from any of the commandments here. There's even a sense where he's actually not quoting directly from the law, and I'll show you that in an instance. But he really seems to be presenting way more a tradition. Yeah, in this and the next section, next time, we'll see that the way he presents it and what he says is not a clear, direct statement from the law, but more something that was traditionally understood of the law. And I'm going to show you what I mean. This discussion on divorce and remarriage is found in Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24 starts this way. Let's read it together. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, and puts it in her hand, and sends her away of his house, and she departs out of his house, and then he continues. And this is not a study on the subject. I want to focus on the certificate of divorce. The way it is written, it really doesn't seem like God says, give them the certificate of divorce, but more they'll be doing that. And God's trying to regulate it. Now, I've looked at different translations, and other than the King James does say that he should give her a certificate of divorce, like God is ordering it. But in the New King James, which tries to correct some of the translation mistakes, it again comes out like this. In a sense where God's saying, this is the tradition you gotta have. In the old Near Eastern way of thinking is you give a certificate of divorce. And God's saying, okay, you could do that, but only under this condition. And we'll get back to the condition soon enough. But again, it's not the only time in the law that God is not actually giving rules, but using traditional rules that's already there. Think of slavery and polygamy. God never said, go ahead, have many wives, or go take as many slaves as you can. No, he actually gives rules on how to do it the right way because it was already something that existed back then. We can never forget, the law was not given, written in the hearts to change people. It was given to give parameters to a culture that already existed with certain norms and traditions. And God's trying to kind of lead them in that. Like he's doing here, and like I said, with slavery and polygamy. They already had this notion of a certificate of divorce. God's just saying there's a right way to do it. And again, we'll take note of that. Indecency, put it in our pocket for later. Because, like I said, it really seems like Jesus is only repeating a tradition, this certificate of divorce thing, and says, you've heard it said that that's the way to do it. Give a certificate of divorce. And back then, back in Jesus' time, there's two school of thoughts when it comes to the right to divorce. One of them, very much more liberal and actually predominant, was this notion of whenever the guy feels like it, he could just give a certificate and the woman has nothing to say about it. You don't want to be married anymore? Boom, certificate. That's your way out. That was predominant, and it seems like that's what Jesus is quoting from. That's the way you guys think. That's your tradition. Which would mean that when you get to verse 32, the next verse, we see that Jesus is actually correcting it through the law. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. This is when we come back to the exception clause. We thought the word was indecency, and different translations will have different words there. The Hebrew word itself is very general and broad. Literally speaking, the word actually means the nakedness of a thing. Yeah, you heard me, the nakedness of a thing. You see it has something to do with sexuality, but it's not very, very descriptive. So there's something about this woman that you've married that is sexually, when you talk about sexuality, there's a nakedness about it. There's something wrong about it. Now, it couldn't have been adultery itself because the law said you have to stone a person like that. So there's something else, but it's not described, and that is Jesus. The word he uses, sexual immorality, is porneia. You've probably heard that word before. It means anything that is sexually inappropriate, except those specific terms like adultery, which he does use. That means really between a man and a wife that's not married, or that's not your wife or your husband. But he's using porneia. When he starts with, he says that's the only exception. And again, it's very broad and general, and we are not going to go into depth. There's good arguments one way or the other what it could mean. Jesus says that's the rule God gave. That's the law he gave. Some kind of sexual brokenness, and we can understand why. Sexuality it's really when two become one. There is this true unity of marriage in sexuality. It's really the core of it. It's not to say it's the most important aspect, but it's core of the unity of marriage. And that's why the Lord in the Old Testament would present idolatry or going to other gods as adultery, spiritual adultery, because you're breaking something core about their relationship with God by going to other gods. Even though there was not always sexuality involved, there's still something core being broken. So there's something core here. And marriage is a testimony of God's love towards us, of Christ towards his church. So there's something important about it. But I go into all the details. There's something important. And when that's broken, you've broken the relationship. You've broken the marriage vows. But if that's not the case, Jesus says, well, you're going to be making her commit adultery. And now you want to scratch your head and say, how? But we can't forget that back then, women didn't actually work for the most part. They couldn't. The only two options a divorced woman had is go back to your family home with your parents or get remarried. And if they're adults, they'll probably go with option B. They don't want to go back to the family home. They want to, be married again. So they would be committing adultery. Same thing, the person that marries her will also be in adultery. Why? Because the divorce is not appropriate. And that's important because a lot of people just take that part, that last part, and say, automatically, if you married a divorced woman or divorced man, that's adultery. Jesus said it. No, he just said, except. And again, this is not an in-depth study on the subject. There is a lot of great teaching going on. And there's so much more to see in the Old and in the New. Jesus himself will have more to say throughout the Gospels, and Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 has more to say too. There's clearly something that we need to study and take seriously when it talks about the subject of divorce and remarriage. We can't just be flippant about it or be dogmatic either. Like I said, some who say no divorce and therefore no remarriage of divorce. Well, no, God does provide certain exception because it's a broken, sinful world. But we have to make sure it is the exceptions God gave. And that's one of the big problems, isn't it? That we take it kind of flippantly, and too many people are getting divorced and even remarried, but the Bible didn't give you permission to. Don't forget, again, Jesus is presenting this to show the ugliness of our hearts. A generation around him that wanted a way out any way they could. Just give the certificate, you're out. And Jesus says, no, that's sin. And not only your sin, but the sin of the other person. Remember with the murder that equal to anger, and how it wasn't just about your anger, but actually the anger of the other person? Right? That's the application Jesus made. If somebody else is angry with you, you have to make peace. Well, there's a sense where Jesus is doing the same thing here. It's not just about you saying, well, I gave you the paper, but I didn't remarry. But then she did. It's your fault if she's in adultery. Because you gave her the paper. You put a circumstance in which she had to do that. So the two of them in sin, it's your fault. You take responsibility. Again, Jesus is really showing how holy God is and how we need to take these things seriously. I hope this is a good reminder of that, dear brothers and sisters. How we have a holy God. And he spoke about these things in depth, and we need to study it to make sure we are walking that straight line, that narrow path. So may it be a reminder of that, and how quick our evil hearts want the easy way out. On this note, be blessed.